So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 9.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So here we have it. The new world, it starts again. And now Noah, he's like the second Adam. And for the second time, God tells Noah to go be fruitful and multiply. And the dominion that had been given to Adam and Eve over the animals, well, that's now gone. And from now on, animals are going to have to fear man, and they should, because now animals have become a part of man's diet in this new world. And God only had given Noah only one stipulation about eating meat, and that's to drain the blood and not to eat the blood with the meat. Now, this stipulation that he gives here, this comes up again in the New Testament in the early church. Because if you remember that the early church was primarily all Jewish, and when it was revealed to the early church, to these Jewish men, that the Gentile races, that all people from all races, that they could be saved, they didn't expect Gentiles to have to become Jews and to follow all the dietary laws that the Jews had. But they did expect them to obey this covenant given to all the nations, to all the races, through Noah. And this was part of that covenant, not to eat blood of animals, but they were free to eat any animals. So for the Gentiles, they can eat all the animals. They weren't restricted to eat only the animals that the Jews could eat. And then after this, and after he tells them that you can't eat the blood because the life is in the blood and life comes from God, he makes a difference between man and animals. And he says, if anybody kills a man, and he's talking about if the animals kill a man or another man kills a man, he says that they're going to be killed by a man. And so this is the beginning of capital punishment. And he tells us it's because man, he's made in the image of God. And so us as people, as men, and men means men and women, that we're higher than the animals. And back here at this time, there was no government. There was no nations. This is just a small family. And it was the family's responsibility to carry out this command. And we see that later in the structure of the Jewish nation, that they come up with this called the Avenger of Blood. And they also came up with these things called cities of refuge, just in case of an accidental death, because God makes a difference between murder and killing. And so this whole new covenant that we're talking about, it's called the Noahic covenant. And this, we're told, it extends to all of Noah's descendants, and it also extends to all the living creatures. And God, 3 times he says, he'll never destroy the earth by flood. And if he hadn't told them this, they would have been terrified every time it rained. And we've had floods since then, but none of them of this type of magnitude that destroyed the world. And we see that God also includes the animals in this covenant. And that shows us that God really does care for animals quite a bit. And we also see that because he's the one who feeds all the wild animals. He feeds the world. And so he seals this covenant, and he seals it with his bow, which is the rainbow. And he says that it'll come when the clouds come. So every time there's a rain, it's the possibility of having a rainbow. And even though we enjoy rainbows and we enjoy their color, we enjoy their beauty, they're not really primarily for us, because it says when he looks on it, that he'll remember that covenant. And if you lived in Hawaii, that's a daily occurrence. You see rainbows all day long, every day. And the world, they may not recognize what rainbows are really about. But when I see a rainbow, I get a joy in my heart. And it's not because of the beauty and all that, but I realize as I'm looking at that rainbow, that God is looking at that rainbow. And he's saying, I remember. He remembers. What it tells me is that in this life, we have many storms. And some of them are really big. These are like storms in our own lives. And a lot of times we'll think, hey, this storm, this one's going to kill me. This is a big storm. But rainbows, they come with storms. And it reminds me that he didn't come to destroy us, and that he's always watching us, and that he will see us through these storms. Okay, so here we are again. We're in the book of Genesis, which is the book of beginnings. And now we're having this new beginning. God, he has just saved man by destroying the wickedness in the world. And now Noah, he becomes a farmer and he plants these grapevines. So we can figure it's been at least 2 years from the flood, because it takes 2 years for grapevines to be able to produce any fruit. And you would think that in this new world and with this new covenant of God with man, that things would be a little better. But then we have our very first story, and we see that God doesn't condemn grapes, and he also doesn't condemn drinking wine. But what he does have a problem with, he has a problem with drunkenness. And that's the problem in the story. We see drunkenness and nakedness. And if you ever notice, drunkenness and nakedness, they go together often. In our society, you get drunk, what happens next? But here, in this story, Noah, he's alone. But the thing is that people, they'll do things when they're drunk that they won't do when they're not drunk. And you could put when they're high, or you could put when they're loaded. And when we're looking at Noah, we're looking at what he did, we're not talking about a wicked man. We're talking about a man who God calls righteous. We're talking about a man who saved his whole family. And when Noah did this, it wasn't a public act. It wasn't private. It was in the privacy of his own tent. But that tells us that even these things we do in secret, our secret sins done in private, they still have the ability to destroy our families, and they have the ability to destroy all the people around us. And that's because there's always a price to pay with sin. But that price is not your salvation, and that price is also not God's love. But sin, it'll always bring about consequences. And the price could become death, because we know that, sin leads to death. But in the end, with sin, nobody ever gets away with anything. And we don't know exactly what happened in the story, but we do know that Ham went into his father's tent, and he went in there uninvited. And Ham, when he did go in there, he saw his father, and he saw him in a state that he should have never seen his father in. He saw his father naked. But instead of leaving quietly or leaving quickly, he didn't even cover his father's indiscretions. But what he did do is he took the opportunity and he delighted himself in it. And it doesn't mean that he lusted, but, in a way it looks to me like he may have been trying to take the old man down a couple pegs. And by the language there, it's not exactly clear what Ham did, though it said that Noah knew what he did. But, maybe Ham's thinking, hey, he's not any different than the rest of us. He's not so righteous. And it's maybe kind of like I caught ya. I got ya. And Ham, he mocked his father. And he mocked his father, but he should have covered his father. Noah is not just only the man who gave him life, and that should have been enough to earn his respect. But you have to remember, Noah also saved his life. Ham didn't save himself. And the truth is, Ham's brothers, they should have never known what he saw. But instead of covering his father, he undid his father. And he went laughing to his brothers. It's probably something like, you got to see this. you got to see your dad now. Your dad's passed out and he's naked and he's drunk. And the Hebrew literally says that Ham told with delight. But Shem and Japheth, they didn't find any pleasure in disrespecting their father. And they actually did what Ham should have done. They covered him. But you see, Ham, he has a perverted nature. Because you see, what we're supposed to do when we see somebody in a sin, we're supposed to cover their sins. Love is supposed to cover sins. 1 Peter 4:8, and above all things, have fervent love for one another. Love will cover a multitude of sins. But here, and we've all seen it, there's a nature that we find in some people that they just want to catch them. They just want to have something on them. They just want to mock them. They want to find something to laugh at us for. They want something to hold over us. Something that they can think, well, I'm better than them. I'm higher. And they're lower. They're a little lower than us. But this type of thinking and this kind of heart, this is from the enemy. This is from the devil. And that's why he's called the accuser of the brethren. He's the accuser of the brethren. It doesn't mean that the things he's saying isn't true. They could be true, but he's still the accuser because it is true, but it should have never been told. And these kind of things should never be mentioned about us as God's people. We should never have a heart like that. And these sins of slander and these sins of gossip, well, when we read about them and what they're listed with, they're listed with the sins of greed, and they're also listed with the sins of murder. And we read that in Romans 1:29. It says, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant boasters, inventors of evil, and disobedient to parents. Now, I'm not suggesting that Ham is guilty of all these things, but his sins have this kind of evil root. And now we see in our story that Noah, he eventually wakes up, and he probably noticed that he was covered and knew that he didn't cover himself. And he spoke to his sons and he found out what Ham did. And so what Noah does is he gives us a prophecy. He speaks out a prophecy of what's going to happen to these three sons of his. And if you read this and you notice, Noah doesn't curse Ham, but he did tell about the destiny of Ham's son, Canaan. And to be clear, people used to say the race of Canaan was the black races. That's not true. They weren't black. They were Middle Eastern. They were the people that actually ended up in the land of Israel. But we do know what happened to the Canaanites. And we know that they were very perverted people, that they were very perverted in their worship, and they were very perverted with their idols and their sexual practices. And we're told that that's why God removed them from that land and gave their land away. It was because of their great wickedness. And archaeologists, they've discovered these idols when they explore the tells in Israel. They know their practices. And these are practices that are so vile, they're not to be spoken of in church or mixed company because they're very, very perverted. And so this prophecy is about these people that are going to be in the land of Canaan. Because remember, who's writing this? This is Moses. Moses is writing the story. And where is he leading these people right now? He's taking them to the land of Canaan. So he's taking them to the land of this people, of this prophecy that the Jews, that the Israelites, the Hebrews at that time, that they're going to dispossess. And a lot of the reason that they had to be dispossessed and had to be removed is because God didn't want his people to learn any of their wicked ways. And we read here that the people that they don't destroy, well, they're going to be the servants. And we do see that because we see the Gibeonites, they make a treaty with Joshua and they become the servants of God. And when we see these wars at the end of Moses' life and in the beginning of Joshua, and we read about these different Canaanites, we're going to see all these same names again that we just read here. It's the same people that had taken root in that land. But most of the battles that they won, they weren't started by the Hebrews. They were actually started by the Canaanites, and all they did is defend themselves, and then they took their land. And Noah, he doesn't curse any other of the Hamitic races. It was only Canaan. So there's nothing wrong with the races of Ham. And just like Noah didn't curse Ham, he also didn't bless Shem. Because if you read that carefully, it says that Noah blessed the Lord, the God of Shem, because Shem's God is the real God. And all blessings are going to come through the descendants of Shem. Because Shem, he's the one to the line of Israel. And he's also the line that's going to lead to the Messiah. And Japheth, he's going to share in this blessing of the tents of Shem. But you see there that Canaan's going to be there over. He's going to be a servant to that God. And that's what we all are. We're all servants to that God. So there's no prejudice with God. He makes no distinction. And so now we see that Noah dies, and he ends up being the third oldest person recorded in the Bible. And he lived for 950 years. And now we got to chapter 10. And chapter 10 is a great chapter. And there's no other record in all of the world written like this record. In any culture, this is called the Table of Nations. And this is where we're giving the record of how the people are repopulated in the world and where these nations came from. And how they come descended from the different line of Noah, from his three sons. And they start with Japheth, the oldest. And the name Japheth, it means to enlarge. And he is the father of all the Gentile nations that settled north and west of Israel. And the Jews would have considered that the outer limits of the whole world. And these people, they would get their spiritual light from Shem. And these would be known as the Indo-European people. And just a real quick rundown of their names, of who they are and who they are in modern cultures. Gomer, those are the Germanic people. Those are the people of Western Europe. That would include the French, the Spanish, the Celts, and all those Western European countries. Magog, Tubal, and Meshech, those are the Russian peoples and the peoples of northern Turkey. Madai, well, that's the Medes, and those are the people that became the people of India and little parts of Iran and little parts of Iraq, but not all of Iran and not all of Iraq. Javan, those were the ancient Greeks. And the Ashkenaz, they're the people that lived north of Judea. Togarma, they're the Armenians. Okay, and the next people group that we look at is Ham. And Ham, though he's not the middle son, he's the youngest. The reason they save Shem for last is because we're going to go on with Shem, because that's the line we're interested in. We're interested in that line that's going to lead to Abraham, to Israel, and to the Messiah. So they're going to do Ham first, and then they're going to do Shem. Because every time the Bible ends up following a line like that, they do it for a few generations, then they stop. But when it comes to the line that leads to the Messiah, they keep going because it's making a record, because we want to know for sure. You can trace Jesus all the way back to Adam. So Ham's descendants, they're largely found in Africa. But there's some that are in the Far East, because we're going to read about that in the next chapter, about Cush's son Nimrod. And he starts that area of Babylon. So Cush, he's the father of the Ethiopians. But it's not what's considered modern Ethiopia, but I guess Ethiopia used to be a different country back then. And then Mizraim, that's Egypt. Put is Libya, which is in northern Africa, west of Egypt. And then Canaan, that's not the people of Israel, but that's the land that they possessed. because Canaanites, you no longer can find a Canaanite in the world. They've just been lost and mixed with the other peoples. Okay, now we're going to be told about the most famous person in the book of Genesis before Abraham, and that would be Cush's son Nimrod. And this is where that saying came, don't be such a Nimrod. And I'm pretty sure it was his father, Cush, that said that for the first time. Son, don't be such a Nimrod. But what Nimrod means is, let us rebel. And we read here, it says that Nimrod was a mighty one on the earth. And that word mighty, what that means is that he was a champion. It means he was a man of superior strength and courage. He was like a player in the Super Bowl. He was like one of the chiefs because he was a chief. But he was the chief of the bad guys. He was not a 49er. He was a chief. And that word mighty there is the same word that describes King David's men. It's the same word when he talks about mighty men, that they were courageous men with superior strength. And then it goes on and it says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that doesn't mean that Nimrod was a sportsman. And it doesn't mean that he hunted game. What it means is that he was a mighty hunter of men's souls. He was a tyrant. And he tried to rule the world by domination and by violence. Nimrod left his father Cush's Ethiopia, and he went east and he conquered his way all the way to Babylon, which was in Asia. And he built this land, and it's called the city of Shinar, but that is Babylon. And he also built 3 other cities. And then after he built that city, he went and he built Assyria and built 3 other cities. But these 2 cities, Babylon and Assyria, those were great enemies that we find of Israel later on that take them into captivity. Okay, and now we get to the last mentioned of Noah's sons, and that's Shem. Now, Shem, you could call him a Shemite, and that's where you would get the word Semite, because Semite and Shemite, it's the same thing, which we know as a word for the Jews, but really all it means is people that actually descended from Shem. And then we're told that the children of Eber, that all the children of Eber came from them. Well, Eber is what they believe the name Hebrew came from. That Hebrew comes from the name Eber. When they're talking about Shem's sons, the first one they mention is Elam. And what Elam is the old name for Persia. And Persia is another name for modern-day Iran. And so actually, this modern-day Iran that hates the Jews, they're actually not too far of relatives from the Jews. And then it talks about Asher, and that's the Assyrians. Lud, that's the Lydians, and they're from Asia Minor. Amram is from the Armenians, or the Syrians. And lastly, there's Arphaxad, and that's where Abraham came from, and that's where eventually Israel descended from. And in this genealogy that we're given, there's a couple interesting names. One is Peleg, or I always say it Peleg, and I don't know why. It sounds wrong. But he's actually an ancestor of Abraham, and we're told that the land was divided in his day.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,